Hello and welcome to VCS Connect. I'm your host, I'm Davpa. Today, we're going to talk about AtariAge. What is AtariAge? AtariAge.com. It is a fan-run website. It's not affiliated with Atari itself, but it's a fan-run website about Atari, specifically the legacy of Atari, the 2600, the 5200, all the way up to the Jaguar. But it is more than just that. It is not only can you get rarity guides, scans of manuals from the Atari Legacy consoles, but there's also forums and a store. The forums talk not only Atari consoles, but other subjects as well. Other vintage consoles, the Coleco, the Intellivision, as well as modern consoles. The Xbox and PlayStation, and everything that's out there now. So it is a community hub for just talking about games, but it does certainly have a focus on vintage Atari equipment and information, as well as the retro gaming community as well, and in a digital and in a store where you can get physical games for, again, predominantly Atari, but they've also branched into other vintage consoles as well, and allowing the homebrew community to create these games for Atari or Intellivision or Coleco. So we're going to take a look at the good and the bad of AtariAge and how they relate to Atari of today and the Atari VCS. One of the best things that AtariAge does is that through their store, they sell new Atari games for the 2600, 5200, 7800, Lynx, and Jaguar, for them all. You got here, for example, for the 2600 Space Game. Now, and you can see here, extremely high quality. This is not a, in the back of a garage, a 3D printed, cartridge. This is, this looks like, it feels like, weight and everything like an original Atari cartridge. And with every game, you get a full color manual. Who doesn't love a manual, for crying out loud? Now, Space Game, if you go on the website, on the store, is $30. So for $30, you get a cartridge and a manual. You can also upgrade, by $15 and get a box. Again, another extraordinarily high quality. You can see from the reflections, a glossy print. I don't know exactly, some kind of cardstock. It feels like a box from original Atari cartridge. This is nothing flimsy. It feels like a box that you would have gotten in 1980 with your game, and it would be sitting up in the shelf at Toys R Us or KB Toys, and you're like, oh, do I want Atari, or do I want Adventure, or do I want Space Game? I want to take Space Game, and there you go. So extremely high quality, and again, all games. I've got Epic Adventure here with a full color manual, and going through here. So AtariAge does an extraordinarily, a fantastic job, creating these physical media for the homebrew community, where they make their creations and they have an opportunity to sell that to the community. But you can also, through the website, just make your own game and make your own print. If you are a programmer and you created a game for your 2600, you don't have to put it in the store. You can just print one copy of yourself, and that's it. Now, AtariAge will watch about, what they don't do is just reproduce anything that you put out there. So if you take a ROM for, let's say, ET, let's use ET as an example, you can't submit a ROM to AtariAge of ET and just have that printed and produced because of copyright issues. So they won't do that. But if you have an original game, you can just do a one-off and print it off yourself, which is a fantastic service. But yeah, this is definitely, creating 5200 games. The 5200, because of AtariAge, has had, I'm going to say a resurgence in popularity, but the 5200 was never that popular. But it has now a larger life and has a continuous life because fans producing new games for the 5200, where most of the world would think, oh, 5200, that was a failed console. Uh, Not to the homebrewing community, taking an example, Adventure 2. This is a fantastic, I mean, this is a superior sequel to Adventure. I'm a big fan of Adventure, and Adventure 2 is fantastic. And really starts to show off the power and the possibilities that the 5200 had. So yeah, that's one of the great services that AtariAge provides, is being able to create high quality physical products for the homebrewing community to extend the life of these great Atari vintage consoles. So AtariAge is a website, and it's going to sound odd, but their strength is their website, which seems to be a no-duh moment, but here we are in their website. And off on the side here, you see look specific systems. Again, AtariAge really focuses on Atari hardware. So if you wanted to find information on, let's say, the 7800, okay? So here you can look up rarity guides, box scans, different companies that worked with the 7800, really broken down into very specific elements that you may or may not be looking for. You want to just look for, let's just look at the rarity guide. Here we go, and we're just going to big old search, and so you can see right here, boom, all the games that are that was produced and made for the 7800. And off on the side, you can see some quick links if you just want to. Oh, this is what I was looking for. Looking for 3D asteroids, right? And see screenshots. Oh, you learned it's a prototype. The rarity guides on the side here. What's something rare? Diagnostic test cartridge. Well, that doesn't sound very exciting. What's number 7 here? Matt Mania? Is that what it is? Mean 18 Ultimate Golf. Let's take a look at that. So Mean 18 Ultimate Golf, you get a description here, and then down up here you can see what the model number of the cartridge was. Let's see, the controller was the Proline joystick. If you wanted to see what the cartridge scan looked like, there you go. Let's go back here. Box scan, taking a look at what the box was. And screenshots. What was this game? Oh yeah, that's a great game. It looks fantastic. All right. Actually, it does. It's I've played Mean 18. It's a pretty damn good game for 1986. And then in this case you can download the ROMs. If you own the game, you can legally download that ROM. But then you can external reviews. There's even links to eBay for a quick search on there. But in the 7800, you can look at hardware, okay, and then a breakdown of all the various types of hardware there. You got the console itself, the Proline joystick, and then the Atari joypad for the 7800. I happen to have a couple of those. They were only available in Europe. That was a major mistake on Atari's part. Should have been the standard controller, as far as I'm concerned. But for each console, you can go into 5200 and see all the different types of hardware, the 4-port, the 2-port, and a breakdown of what was available for there. And certainly the 2600, when we start getting into hardware, certainly a large variety, because that was a console that lived on maybe a little too long for its own good. But yeah, so it's amazing what AtariAge over these years have gathered together information-wise, and has made available for people to see and look through. Looking through the old catalogs. Boy, those was so exciting to look through catalogs of future games. You can go into here and see, just the different games. And then, of course, you get into the forums, right? And start talking about, looking for the subjects that you want. And they certainly breaks you down in the beginning, the Atari system, Atari General, 2600, 5200, blah, 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 and on, and even the Atari VCS. We're going to get a little bit more into the forums in just a minute or so. But on the positive note, the AtariAge forums are quite robust, quite active, and covers a lot of different subject matters. Not only just Atari, but other classic consoles. ColecoVision and Television, the Bailey Arcade, Astrocade, Odyssey 2, and on and on. Classic computing, modern consoles. So there's a ton to go through, and it's always growing, and it is quite active. So it is definitely AtariAge's heart. It's this is what it is, and it does a damn good job at that. Now, talking about some of the negative things of AtariAge. One of the negative things is the toxic nature of the forums at times. There are certain sections where there are a lot of people that are extraordinarily helpful, but then there are parts and people who are just gatekeepers or just people who just love to complain. And I know, big shock, it's the internet. But it goes a little deeper than that. There is an underlying current for quite a few people that Atari is not the real Atari, and this very tired narrative. And, what do I think about that narrative? I only drive cars that Henry Ford built himself. Anything else is not legit. I only eat chicken made by this guy because anything else is not authentic. The only real Apple computer that was ever built was the one that the Woz and Jobs made, the Apple I. Anything else are posers. If she didn't cook the cookies, it's garbage. Well, I kind of agree with that one. Mostly, I think it's now time for the community to just move on, to let some things go. No company stays the same over time. And companies grow, evolve, and change. And, Atari went through a very dark time where it got passed around like a hat between people. After Warner Brothers, shed off Atari to Jack Tramiel, and then Tramiel, sold it off. Then after Atari went under, it went from a holding company to a hard drive company to Hasbro until eventually it got into Infogrames. They purchased it, and in the beginning there, Infogrames wasn't the greatest holder of the Atari name and legacy, right? Like a lot of the companies that preceded it. And what I think a lot of the negativity towards Infogrames that eventually became Atari SA was that they were very aggressive in terms of protecting their IPs, from people who were making clones or illegal games based off of the IPs that now Grams had purchased and owned. And that's tough, it's a tough situation. You don't like to see companies being really aggressive and suing people for creating games, like Nintendo, right? But at the same time, they have every right to protect their property. It'd be like, you're sitting in your home and you look out your window and there's someone cooking, on your grill. And you go out there and say, hey, what are you doing on my grill? Well, you don't use it, so I figured I'd use it, get some use out of this grill. Well, it's not that person's grill, right? It's kind of the same thing with intellectual property rights. Companies are based, their value is based on the patents and the intellectual property rights that they possess as part of their company. So companies need to be protective of those things. But certainly through the court of public opinion, when something is pursued very aggressively, it never looks good. And I think that that's exemplified by the Jeff Minter situation that arose between Atari and Jeff Minter, centering around TXK. Uh, Minter created a game called TXK, which was clearly a Tempest game, and published it on the PlayStation Vita, with plans to put it onto other platforms. Well, Jeff Minter doesn't own the property rights, the IP of Tempest. Atari does, and so Atari stepped in and said, "No, you can't do that." And you know, and they didn't look good doing it. But Minter didn't look good for selling, for creating and trying to sell a game that he didn't have the rights to create. But certainly Atari looked worse in that pursuit of that, because everyone feels that, Minter makes the best Tempest games. Well, you may think that, but still, by law, he doesn't own Tempest. Just because he makes the better Tempest games, in your opinion, doesn't mean he has possession of the rights to, make Tempest without the permission of the owner of the IP of Tempest, which is Atari. But neither of them, I mean, it certainly didn't make Atari look good, and it's very understandable to hate that and say, especially we're game players. We want to play a game, and there's a game, and now you're preventing us from playing that game. It's a sucky situation. And certainly looking back and seeing it, with 2020 vision, you can look back and say, wow, that just wasn't handled well. 100% it wasn't handled well between both parties on that. And you hope for better on that. But to hold Atari continuously on some of those actions, when the people who were involved in running Infograms and Atari SA during those times are not even there anymore. It's not fair to the current Atari, right? It's not fair to them to be constantly held to actions on people or even corporate structures of the time that doesn't exist and it's not in place anymore. So there's a certain point where the community who's just holding on to this, and beating it like a dead horse, needs to move on. It's not healthy. It's not helpful in any way. But you certainly try to hold the current Atari and to better standards. And damned if they don't, right? But at least you have to give them an opportunity to show that they've changed and or not the same type of company that they were those years back when they did things like attacking, aggressively attacking IP violators. But yeah, it's never a good situation, and certainly, you hope for better. And so far, as far as I can tell, those changes have been very predominant in the current Atari. They're much more open to fan input and listening and getting feedback and and not pursuing people down for that. They're going to protect their intellectual property rights. If someone creates a game without their permission, that's their bread and butter. That's why they exist as a company, to do these things. So they have to protect it. But, I guess time will tell if they revert back to old ways in terms of that. But it certainly seems like they have changed a lot. But, we'll see. We'll see in due course of time. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk something very specific about the forums, the toxic nature of the forums, particularly when it comes to this individual, Tommy Tallarico, the former CEO of the Intellivision and the project Intellivision Amico. Tommy Tallarico created and started a thread in the AtariAge forums about the Amico. I don't remember what the exact title of it is, but it became the center point of an incredible amount of toxicity out there that reached out to a lot of different fronts. To some YouTubers that were questioning the Amico, and reporters, as well as any even AtariAge forum members who questioned that. It became this cult of personality zone. And it was quite notorious, even in the worlds outside of AtariAge, of just how this thing spiraled out of control. And, I can't remember how many pages it was. It was like hundreds of pages on there. And so many comments and so many claims by Tallarico, and that you look back at some of those claims and comments, and some of them have aged like fine milk. And I'm not going to get into a whole lot right now. I do have a specific Intellivision Amico from a VCS fan's point of view, and I'm going to save a lot of my comments and thoughts on that. But one of the things that I think I need to address is that he took a lot of shots at Atari and the VCS, which is kind of galling since this was an AtariAge forum. It was kind of this center of Atari. But he tapped into some of the resentment and some of the hatred that many forum members had of Atari SA. And he threw kerosene onto the fire. And I believe he did that very specifically to undercut his competition. As much as he claims of changing the gaming world with this Intellivision Amico, his real true competition was the Atari VCS, because both relied on basically nostalgia bait, of 40-plus-year-old Gen X gamers who knew about the Intellivision, who knew about the Atari. And unlike Atari, Intellivision didn't have that name recognition outside of the retro community. They don't. Atari has a large legacy existence that exists outside of the gaming world. Even kids now at least have heard of Atari. Intellivision, not so much. In the last couple of years, and unfortunately, with the mess that has become of the Intellivision Amico, there is a lot more name recognition, but certainly not in a positive light. But Tallarico was quite strategic in this, that he knew that his market for this Intellivision Amico, despite his claims of this is a family console, he really seemed to only concentrate on those Gen X gamers. And so the Atari VCS represented a direct competitor for the Amico. So he did many things to undercut and to badmouth and to, I don't know if slander is the right word, but, to just knock down the VCS. Some of the very snide comments about the ownership, the people who run it, their just a large variety of things that not only just fueled that underlying toxicity that existed there, but just allowed it to explode and to expand. So I just wanted to take a brief moment to to mention his involvement in this current toxicity. Now, a lot of it has died down, especially coming to light of what the Amico eventually seems to have turned into, where I don't believe that it started out as any kind of scam, but as things got desperate for Tallarico and other members of the Intellivision, it certainly went into shadier practices of just trying to keep alive. Meanwhile, everything that he claimed about Atari and the Atari VCS is completely not true. The Atari VCS came out. The Atari VCS is being supported by Atari, and all that. Again, I'm going to get more into that in another video, specifically about what is the VCS and what it isn't. But certainly, he certainly did his best to try to demolish anything that was the VCS in the minds of his potential market for the Intellivision Amico. Another negative that I want to talk about AtariAge is, frankly, the flip side of one of the positive things I talked about. the games, the physical media that they produce. The downside is that while there are a lot of great games that are originals, like Adventure 2 and Time Salvo, there are other games that the rights, you start getting into murky areas. For instance, I've got here a 5200 cartridge of that was originally, it's Tempest. It was originally the prototype of Tempest that was going to be done on the 5200, and with the Atari's collapse in the 80s, and sold off in Sunnyvale. Somehow the prototype kind of floated around, and then finally was found and finished off, and then was put into a physical cartridge, the 5200, which the prototype was created. Another example is, this fantastic recreation of Qbert for the 7800, B asterisk NQ, however you pronounce that. It's fantastic. It's a wonderful game, but it's Qbert, right? So, they don't have the license from Sony, who is the license owner of Qbert, to technically produce this. So you get into this, AtariAge delves in this gray area where they, there's a 2600 for Halo 2600, right? I've heard it's a good game. Is it really Halo? Well, no, but it's more the fact that, someone used marketing and the Halo brand on this game for the 2600, right? That's more the issue than the game itself. I don't think anyone's going to look at a 2600 game and go, well, wait a second, that's Halo. That's not the issue. You start delving into the, AtariAge kind of dips its toes into these murky areas and a little bit illegal areas. I think what avoids the bolt of Zeus legal actions against them is the fact that it's being produced for out of date legacy consoles, right? No one's throwing up the team of lawyers to go after Qbert on the 7800. I mean, I care about the 7800. Most of the world does not care about the Atari 7800. And that's kind of where they're getting away with this. It's that it's so niche that it's not taking away profits from, in this case, Sony, for producing Qbert. But if something was to change their mind, they could easily go after a game like this. And the same thing with Atari. Atari could easily go after the making of this 5200 game. But the fact that it's on the 5200, which out of all their consoles is probably the most maligned of the consoles, Atari, turns a blind eye, just like Sony turns a blind eye, much like Microsoft is turning a blind eye to a version of Halo in the 2600. But every single one of those companies has every right to protect their imagery, their intellectual property, their IPs. And so all of those games that delve into either a reproduction of a game that they didn't have the rights to do, or with marketing or calling on a name that they don't have the rights to do, really is ultimately tempting fate against the team of lawyers that could be sent on them. And again, because these are old legacy consoles and niche consoles, there's not, they're not selling millions of these, and they're not taking away profits from Sony on it. It's this kind of little gray area that they kind of nestle themselves in. And that's kind of where AtariAge kind of gets stuck a little bit. It's hard for AtariAge to strike, to gain a good relationship with Atari, for example, because of these gray area sections that they have there. Because then the larger company like Atari gets associated with some of these more, gray area or straight out illegal activities, and you can't do business that way, right? So AtariAge has kind of stuck themselves in this gray zone where they can't then do things and branch out. They're an island unto themselves in that way. So that's one of the negative things of AtariAge, and and with some of the consequences of creating some of these, these physical medias. Again, high quality. This is fantastic. Sony would be proud of this, but they don't have the rights to produce a reproduction of Q*bert. But it's a really good version of Q*bert. They just really shouldn't be doing it. So we've just looked at the good and the bad of AtariAge, and so that begs the question: where do we go from there? That's a tough one. There's no easy answer to that question. There is definitely a lot of bad blood between AtariAge and Atari. A lot of it stemming from the forums, and especially after Tommy Tallarico and his cult of personality thread for the Intellivision Amico. But I would like to think there are ways to start mending fences. AtariAge has, for the longest time, been the sole keeper of the flame, as it were, keeping Atari alive, at least in spirit, by servicing the consoles that were before. We haven't had a new console, the VCS is the first new console since the Jaguar in the mid-90s. And so AtariAge should really be praised for being able to keep the enthusiasm to gather the people who were true fans of Atari, whether you were a fan of the 2600 or the Jaguar or all in between. And it became a place where people can discuss, people can learn things about the consoles, how to fix them, how to get better performance out of them, and then eventually, where can hey, I can create a new game for that. Great. And Atari's Age began to be able to produce cartridges, physical media for these games. And it really is a wonderful thing. And that's really one of the things that they do best, is making these physical cartridges, high quality cartridges. So Atari should, in terms of their legacy hardware, allow AtariAge to be able to produce Atari-owned IP reproductions. That's kind of the caveat. AtariAge could produce Dodgem and Codebreaker or Adventure, right? And they can do it cost effectively and in small numbers. That's the key. Atari can't produce a lot of cartridges that are cost effective in small numbers. AtariAge can. And as much as it would be like, as much as we'd like to think that, oh, everyone would get a cartridge, it's not necessarily the case. Atari was a big company in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of cartridges were produced. I know myself as a collector, there's not much out there that I don't already have. There are a few games that I was like, yeah, I would like a new cartridge, a new version of this one particular cartridge or that particular cartridge. But I'm not going to go out and buy every single thing out there. So we're dealing with small numbers here. Not anything that Atari would deem profitable. But AtariAge can do those quantities, those small number quantities, and still service the community, and still service the vintage hardware of Atari. And I think there should be an understanding between Atari and AtariAge to allow AtariAge to do that. But that's not a carte blanche to just produce any cartridge that Atari ever produced. I mean, certainly games like, for instance, E.T. Atari doesn't own the intellectual property rights of that. They can't produce E.T. as much as people probably would say, hey, I want a new E.T. They can't do that. So AtariAge needs to refrain from producing E.T.s or other games like that where Atari doesn't have the licenses anymore to do those games. Berserk, Defender, unfortunately, very favorite games, especially when you start talking about the Activision games. And that is definitely a no-no that, AtariAge can't do. What else AtariAge could do is basically become a developer. They're producing games, right? Adventure 2, for example. You can buy a physical cartridge, or you can get, as a cheaper option, and for the VCS, a digital copy for the VCS of Adventure 2. So they can basically become a developer where they work with the gaming community, the retro, 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit community, to then have them as a developer who then puts, submits the game to the VCS to be able to be played on the VCS. And I think that would be a wonderful position for AtariAge to do that, where then there are even more options. I can get Adventure 2 for my 5200, or now the 800 computer line, the XEs or the 800s, or get Adventure 2 for the VCS. So those are a couple ways that some fences can be mended and allow AtariAge to do what they do well. And there's quite a bit that they can do well. But what are your thoughts? What do you think that can be done to start mending, building bridges between AtariAge and Atari and have them be able to work together? There's certainly hurdles to be overcome. As I mentioned before, the shady aspects of the reproductions that they do, some of the things that they don't own the IP rights to, they have to cease doing. And for Atari to be able to do a more overt working relationship or even contract work, some of those very questionable elements need to be addressed and frankly need to cease. And that kind of handcuffs Atari from being really able to do anything with AtariAge. So AtariAge has some things that they really need to address if they want to do something with Atari in an official capacity, or maybe they don't. So what are your thoughts? What can AtariAge do? What should they do? And what should Atari do in regards to AtariAge? So leave a comment. That would be great. And until next time, hey, you enjoy whatever game you're playing, and I'll see you next time.